So, hello and welcome to this session on scientific writing. And we're going to be focusing on aspects of scientific writing which are going to help you produce the sort of level of writing that's required at level 6. And we're going to be focusing on some really key aspects of this to make sure that you're really showing criticality in your writing, which is absolutely crucial at this level. So, at the end of the session, and at the end of taking the quizzes and doing the activities, this is what you're going to be able to do. You're going to be able to identify what is and what isn't scientific writing. You're going to be able to evaluate those examples to see what makes them good or better than each other. And through doing that, you're going to be able to describe the features of good scientific writing, the things that you need to include, the things you need to make sure you don't do. And then you will also leave this session with a process which is going to help you produce level 6 scientific writing so that you can start to move through an effective process to be able to write good quality, critical scientific writing. So, this might seem like an odd place to start, but I think it's worth mentioning this. Scientific writing isn't all about the writing. It's really important that we think of it as more than that. And what I'm going to talk about here is maybe something which is going to require you a little bit to be a little bit reflective in relation to any writing you've produced previously. So if you've previously approached your assignments by kind of getting the question, giving it a quick read over, putting the whole question maybe into Discover or into online database search, or maybe some keywords, gathering together very quickly some resources, having them open on a number of different screens on your laptop, and then you flick between them, reading a little bit here, writing a little bit there, reading a little bit here, writing a little bit there. And then we sort of end up finishing and we go back and fling our references in. If you've used that kind of approach before, this is a time to think differently and to stop working like that. And this is why I'm talking a little bit about reflection. It might be worth really thinking critically about any feedback you've had from lecturers about your writing. You might have had feedback where they've commented that your structure is quite good, but at times your criticality isn't really showing through as well as it might. You might have had some comments that at times your structure or your grammar is a little informal and not really academic enough. You might have had some comments that maybe you've missed references out, or there are sections in your writing which, aren't referenced correctly. If you've had feedback like that, and you have been using a writing model similar to the one I've just outlined, this is a good time to take stock of that feedback and really try to rebuild a more effective writing process, which means that your scientific writing is more likely to be of the standard that we want you to produce at level 6. And that's not just about us saying you've got to reach a standard. Going through a better writing process means that you are getting much more out of completing these assignments. You're going to be learning more. That learning will have more value. So the whole thing is a much more accurate reflection of what you've been doing on your programme than just something you flung together the day before. So, what am I actually talking about? What would be a useful process? Where do you start with this process? Well, the first stage in this effective process is to break down the question. Now, by that, I don't mean you read it 4 or 5 times and then rush off and grab those resources. I mean really breaking down the question. So if you have a look here on this slide, I've written out a question here. Evaluate the assertion that a low carbohydrate, high fat diet is effective for young athletes to sustain high intensity training. So there's a question. It's quite similar to ones we've probably seen before. So stop and think. What would you usually do if you see that sort of question? How would you use that question to start researching? Which aspects of it would you pull out? What would you think about? Well, I'm going to ask you to think in detail about this question as an example, and then to apply that process to all questions that you see in the future. Key things in assignment questions are these words that we see here: evaluate. Evaluate is a key word that we often see along with critically analyse or critically review. These aren't just thrown in. These words have meaning, and pausing to make sure that we understand that meaning can really help us begin to see exactly what that question is about. What we tend to do is kind of run over that word and then start focusing on these content words: low carbohydrate, high fat diet, young athletes. And that's important. But those words are really descriptive words. We need to use them to make sure that we read information that's relevant to the question. But thinking a little bit more about what we're being asked to do with that content really will push us to more effective research. So for this example, evaluate means appraise the worth of something in the light of its truth or usefulness, and assess and explain this. So if we think about that in relation to the content words, what we've got to do is to decide from our research whether this diet is something that's positive for these athletes doing this. Where is the truth or the evidence that this is actually effective? Where is the evidence that this is useful? So what we're looking for in the research is to find out if there's research which proves that this diet is useful, if there's evidence to prove that this assertion is the truth, that there is research and evidence to prove this. And then moving on though, we're assessing, we're thinking about that evidence. So although there may be some evidence, is it strong enough? Is the research based on, enough research that contained enough participants? Is it research which is up to date? We have to assess that as well. And then we need to move on and explain that assessment. So pausing and looking at these question words in relation to the content words is really going to help us begin to formulate a plan for our research. So what we're doing is we're following this model. We're looking at the question. We're not just stopping at the description, the content words. We're moving around this circle. We're analysing that in more detail. We're linking the descriptive content words with analysis of that question word that's been used by our lecturer. And then we're evaluating what that means in relation to the type of thing we have to read and what we have to look for in that reading. So actually moving through and evaluating the question as a first step means that what we're able to do is to build a rough plan. Yes, sounds mad, doesn't it? We often think of planning in relation to writing just being something that we do just before we write. But this question evaluation is actually going to help us start thinking about what we need to do in much more detail. And it means we enter into the stage where we collect our reading and research with a much clearer idea already about what we're looking for and what might be relevant. And we're also building up questions that are going to help us when we start reading. So what we're thinking in this research plan is that here we've got those descriptive words, things that we really need to find out about, the scientific, technical detail to help us really make sure that the research we're looking at is going to be useful, and also to help us assess whether some of the things we're reading are relevant to the question. But then we're moving on to analysing that in more detail. Who suggests this? Is this suggested possibly by people who have some sponsorship? Is this suggested by just one certain set of researchers working in a small field related to a small sporting area? Why are they suggesting it? Are they suggesting this because there's evidence to show that if young athletes don't eat this sort of diet, they suffer some problems further down the line? And we're evaluating, we're thinking now already, this is what I'm going to have to think about when I start reading things. This is what I need to look for. So what we're building up here is an evaluation of the question, and then we're building up questions that we need to answer from that evaluation. And we're adding in here, remember, some of the things you already know. Your questions are designed to things that you've been learning about on your programme. So remember, as you jot down this basic, starting off research plan, you will also be thinking about what you already know about the topic to add in to help you pull out relevant research and then read it effectively. So let's pause for a moment. Thinking about what I've just said and thinking about the necessity to evaluate the question, I want you to look at this example from some student writing. I want you to stop and think. You might want to pause this. Has this student spent enough time thinking about the question before they've written? So stop, pause, read the question and this extract, and think about the ideas I've just spoken about. Has this student really thought about the question before they've written? So, did you have a read? What did you think? Well, I think that this student's done some research. I can see it. We can see it here in the referencing, can't we? But I would suggest that this is definitely a good example of somebody who didn't spend enough time really analysing the question and has focused too much just on the content words rather than all of the words around the content words. Here, really important, critically discuss. Critically discuss, what does it mean? It means we need to look at all aspects of something, comparing and contrasting opinions, views, research, looking at what ideas might be stronger or weaker than the other. And what are we actually critically discussing then? We're not just critically discussing what happens if you sit down too much, which is really what's being shown here. No, this question is not just about that. It's about something very, very specific. It's about whether in the workplace, companies who introduce strategies to help their workers move about, not sit down all day. What this is about is whether those strategies do have an impact and mean that people don't sit down for great lengths of time at work. It's not just about what happens if you sit down too much. And this research here is really about that. Now, this isn't necessarily irrelevant, but if you have a very short word count and you have to write a very focused answer, it's really important that all the words that you use in that answer are related to the question. So you don't have time for things that are kind of connected. And spending time really looking at all aspects of the question will mean that you are less likely to start picking things which are only a little related or related in the wider sphere rather than the specific sphere, which is what's happened here. So I would suggest that this student hasn't spent enough time really analysing the question, and they focused in on the content words, shoved that in to research something, found something that's relevant to that content word and gone ahead and used it. So this is what happens if we don't spend enough time analysing the question. Right, so I've talked a lot about analysing the question and building up a plan of what you need to research and what you need to look for in that research. So what I've got here is a video, and I'm going to come back to this video down below in the questions, just to remind us of the sort of things we need to be looking for and the things we need to be mindful of in our research to make sure that we're using good quality research in order to answer our questions. So you might want to have a look down at this video in the questions. As this is a video recording, you won't be able to play it from here. But if you look down, you'll see this video down below and some questions based on it, just to check that we're really secure in the type of thing we need to be looking for in order to research effectively, and then the sort of content we need to read and review in order to be able to write good quality scientific writing. So, one thing I want to just come on to here, just thinking now, we're at the point where we're still collecting our reading, and we're moving into the reading phase, which we're going to talk more about in a moment. But just to make sure that, especially at level 6, it's really important that you spend more time, as this diagram is showing, researching, reading and analysing than writing up. At this phase, you need to make sure that you are reading widely, so you're getting a full range of opinions. So you're looking at things and getting a full view of what the research is saying. So this doesn't mean, to go back to that strategy I told you about at the beginning, which wasn't very effective, that means that we're not reading and then writing all at the same time. We are going through a strategy, a process, which means we will be spending more time thinking about the question, collecting our research and reading and analysing that research before we start the writing process, which is actually the smallest part of this whole process. So what do I mean? What are we doing with this reading? Well, there's an easy way of thinking about it, okay? So what you've done now is you've used all your question analysis words and thoughts about the topic, and you've started collecting some sources that seem relevant. What do you do now? What's the next part of our process? What we do now is that we zoom in on that research, and we zoom in on that research and we look at it in great detail. We don't just skim over it. We really analyse this research. And how do we do it? Well, again, we move through this model. So we zoom in and we look for these descriptive elements. But then we push on. We look in detail about how the research was conducted, what theories are maybe being put forward. We're pushing into the reading to really pull out really important information that's going to help us use it effectively in our writing. So if we're looking at a study, we're looking at how many participants were in that study, whether the amount of participants is going to be high enough for us to be able to rely on that study. Maybe something that we might need to point in our writing, that there may be some limitations to a study. We can only do this in our scientific writing if we're really zooming in and looking at our sources and our research in great detail, and asking these sorts of critical questions when we're reading, but always thinking and evaluating, is this relevant to my assignment? As we just saw in that example, is this just about one tiny aspect of the assignment? Or is this something that I can use to really build an answer to the whole question? And we're pushing on. And we're thinking all the time, what do I think about this? Okay, this is a good study. What do I think about this? This study seems a little bit odd. It's just about cycling. I'm not really sure whether I can use that here. We're really zooming in on our reading and asking these sorts of critical questions. So this is a good place to just mention the dreaded words of note-making. Okay, so really important and central to scientific writing is note-making. So by this, I don't mean, notice I'm saying note-making, not taking. What I mean is that you really must make sure that as you're zooming in, you are creating sets of notes which are going to be useful for you to start writing up. So this is not just highlighting. I know that we might have less access to paper copies at the moment, but we can highlight, as we know, online. We're not just randomly highlighting things and making something look really beautiful and then coming back 3 days later and wondering why we're making it beautiful. No, what we're doing is we are making sure that we are focusing in with those critical questions on our reading. And then what we do is we start pulling out relevant information, not just copying out either. So a strategy to make sure that we're making valuable notes which are going to be useful to answer a question is to, this suggestion is read through a section of the text. Don't write anything down, just read it. Then write down 3 to 5 words, key words that you remember from the key points in that text, and then spend some time expanding those, then go back to the reading and check whether you've included anything or, you've included everything relevant, and add in things like statistics, which obviously we can't really be expected to remember and really shouldn't be remembering just off the top of our head. If we're going to use them in our writing, we need to make sure that they are exact. So this is a strategy for making notes. It's also a strategy which means that we are critically thinking about the evidence and the research to produce notes which are going to be really useful for our writing. So not just highlighting, but trying to really move beyond just looking and highlighting and thinking, oh, that sounds interesting, to really pushing ourselves to thinking about what we're reading and then to make notes based on that reading, which we're going to be able to use for our writing. So once we've got those notes, what we do now is we zoom out. So we look at all our notes that we've made from all our sources that we've zoomed in on and we've pulled out all the key points from in relation to our topic. And then what we do is we start zooming out and looking at all those different sources in contrast to each other. So we're now looking at the big picture that we've got from looking at all these different sources. And we're looking at the connections between these sources, which are saying the same things, which are saying different things. So we're building up now a big overview of a critical picture of our reading. A good thing to think about here is if you've only read 1 or 2 sources, when you zoom out, it's going to be very difficult for you because you've just got 2 things. So this is why, to go back to that point with the iceberg, it's really important that you've done enough reading to be able to zoom out, to look to see whether the majority of people say this, or there's a collection of sources that point to this answer, but on the other hand, there's a collection of sources that point to that one. Or these particular sources, when joined together, really build up a really strong argument that this is the correct path or the correct solution or the correct suggestion. We can only do that if we've read enough to look at the connections between our texts and see then how all that zoomed in information can be joined together to build our critical scientific writing. One way of recording this is to use this sort of grid. This is a critical reading grid. And what we can start to do is, as we zoom out, we can create grids like this, which help us focus on those key zoomed in details and then start bringing those zoomed in details together to see how these sources will be joined together in our writing. So here, these sections here are related to the zoomed in analysis, but these sections here are related to the zoomed out analysis. How do these points from all our various sources, how are we going to use them? How are we going to show the significance? And what conclusions do we want to come to about those sources? So this is one way of critically recording reading when we're in that zoomed out phase. And obviously come back to this slide and you might want to read my notes on what to put in each section in more detail. So let's have a look at an example to see whether we can see this zooming in and zooming out process coming out in this example of scientific writing. So let's think. We talked about zooming in and collecting really important key details from the reading, which would show why we'd selected that research. And what we can see here is that this student has zoomed in. We've got specific detail and numbers here, which indicate that they've really looked at this research in great detail. And they're using that to build a picture. There were 3,000 participants. Here we've got 9,000 participants. They've pulled out key details from zooming in, which are building up a picture of how that research is being used to answer the question, which has critically discussed the importance of physical literacy for participation in physical activity. So they've zoomed in. What zooming out? Well, let's look here. We've got this. These findings were echoed in. So what we've got up here is some really important information and detail from one particular study. But then they've zoomed out and they've looked at another study in relation to that first study they've outlined. And what they're doing is they're building up this critical picture of how these two studies work together. So they've zoomed in to get the detail, and then they've zoomed out to show how these studies work together. And then at the end here, the findings of these two similar studies clearly demonstrate. So they're building to a very powerful critical conclusion by having outlined the relationship between two studies and also the details in those studies. So this is showing zooming in and zooming out. So where are we now? Where are we up to in this presentation? Let's find our way through this process. So we've been talking about a process we need to use to produce good quality level 6 scientific writing. And we've said that this process begins with really getting into the question, digging deep into the question, working out what it's telling us, looking at the question word in detail, looking at the content words in relation to those question words. They're using that to formulate an initial research plan, using that research plan to make sure that we're choosing research and readings, journal papers that are really relevant to the question, because we've got a really good idea about what the question is asking us to research, read, and then write about. And then we've thought about that reading. Once we've collected it, what do we do with it? How do we read it? We read it critically, we ask it questions, we use those questions to create meaningful notes that we can use, and then we zoom back out again and we look at all those notes that we've made from all those readings, and we start looking for the connections between those readings so that we can build that into our writing. And we've seen how that works in an example that we've just looked at. So that's where we're up to. This is where we are in our process. So what's next? Well, now we're going to something that you might have thought we would have done earlier. Now we're going to really think about planning in detail for our writing. Loads of ways to plan. You might have a strategy that works for you. Some people mind map, some people just put post-its on a wall. This is a basic planning grid. So now what you've got is you've got all your readings, you've zoomed out and thought about how they connect together. So now what we do is we take that a little bit further and we start looking with the question in front of us. And a really top tip now is get that question in front of you, type it out, write it on a piece of paper, have it in front of you as you're planning. And then we start working through with all those really great notes and all those, maybe critical reading grids that we've used. We start putting that together and building a paragraph plan. Now, obviously, we're thinking in terms of our word count, and we're thinking in terms of making sure that, we use all the words to answer the question. So if we've got a smaller word count, we don't want to waste time with a big general introduction, but we need to introduce the concept a little, but then we're working through making sure that all our paragraphs are clear, and we're writing down maybe if we need to. What is often really helpful is if we start also writing in this plan what we're going to use in terms of evidence in each of the paragraphs, because that helps you as you start writing up. So this is what we're doing now, okay? We've moved through and now we're really beginning to think, how are we going to structure this scientific writing? How are we going to make sure that we're going to use all that work we've done to really produce a good piece of scientific writing? So, why plan? Okay, everyone's always talking about planning. And, you know, to go back again to the beginning, if you've used that kind of strategy of reading right at the same time and your grades have been okay, you know, remember that we're moving on to level 6 now, and that strategy may not hold up now. We're asking a little bit more of you. But I just want you to pause for a minute and look at this example, because it really brings home to you why planning is really, really critical, okay? So just pause for a second and have a read here. And what I want you to see here is that this piece of writing is really very, very general. It's not particularly academic or scientific in style and tone, and we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But what we're seeing here is somebody who's kind of just waffling. Key take-home message. It's not a journey, it's a destination. This, to me, really shows somebody who's probably using that strategy of reading and writing at the same time. It's showing that there's been some thought, but it's not planned. This is very much sort of off the top of your head style of writing. And it's really important, you know, if you've got a tight word count, you don't want sections of your writing to be like this. What are you saying? What do you want the reader to understand? How are you demonstrating to your lecturer that you've zoomed in and zoomed out and asked critical questions of the reading? If you're going to produce little sections of writing, or even a whole section of writing which looks like this, which is a little bit empty, which doesn't really indicate research, it doesn't really indicate how you've thought about how research might relate to each other. So just to remind us, the planning is really necessary, because planning means that we've got a clear idea about what we want to write and what we're going to use from our zoomed in and zoomed out reading. And that means we're going to set out and all the words will count and all the words will give us an answer. So really important that you plan, because if you don't, you end up writing whole pieces like this. Because we come to a point where we think, oh, I don't really know what to say now, so we start just throwing down anything. A plan is going to mean we're not going to get to that point because we know what we're going to say. So let's move on. We've got a big general plan. We know what we're going to put in our paragraphs. Now let's do weed, because weed paragraphing, fantastic strategy to really make sure that your paragraphs are showing criticality and are focused scientific pieces of writing. Now, the weed paragraph structure is, as you can see, it's 4 parts. So a weed paragraph would have a first opening sentence that indicates to the reader what the paragraph is about. Now, some people write these sentences as part of their plan. And that means that it's really clear to the reader what the topic is. Then we fill the main body of our weed paragraph with all that really great zoomed in and zoomed out analysis, the explanation of the topic, examples to support the topic. But we don't just stop there. We don't just leave our lecturer to draw the conclusions that maybe we think are obvious. No, remember, our job here in scientific writing is to answer that question and to show that we know how the research we've looked at builds to an answer to that question. So really important part of this is the final sentence of your paragraph. What do you want the reader to do with the information? Why have you given them those evidence and those examples? So here is where we bring it all back and tie it to the question. This is where we show that what we've said links to the answer. So let's look at an example to help. So let's have a look at this little example to see weed. Apologies for some of the little word corrections on here, but I think this is, a really good example. we've got a nice opening sentence here in blue, which is telling the reader what this whole little paragraph is about. So we're going to be finding out about why, people who are obese possibly don't, they don't think about the balance between exercise and diet. So that, we're coming into this paragraph with a nice clear opening sentence telling us what we're going to read about. And then we're moving into that in a little bit more detail, because what we have now is a little bit of an explanation of that. Okay, so it's becoming clearer and clearer why this is being written about. And it's becoming clearer and clearer why this is being written about in relation to the question. So that's a key point, isn't it? You've been asked to critically discuss the relationship between physical activity and obesity. Well, here's a key point about that relationship. And here's a really good explanation of why that's important. And then the main body of this little paragraph here, this purple section, there's the zoomed in and zoomed out evidence. We've got some reference to research here, which supports this, which explains this. And then finally, in our green section at the bottom, what we're doing is we're popping out at the end of the paragraph with a conclusion relating to the topic of the paragraph overall, but also relating overall to the question. So we've got a clear package of writing where we come into that package of writing understanding what the topic is. That topic is explained and supported with evidence and examples from research. And then there is a conclusion here. It's a conclusion which relates back to the question. Okay, so we're going to move in now. We've had a look at, some of the aspects of writing and content and organisation, but there's this section here is going to relate a little bit more to some activities I'm going to ask for you to do down below. So basically, this is about language. Now, we've seen lots of examples of good language in some of the paragraphs we've looked at so far. But what I want to just highlight here are some really, really key elements of language. And I'm going to ask you to examine these in more detail in the quiz down below. So the first thing that I'm going to talk to you about is the way that we introduce research in our writing. Scientific writing needs to be very focused and very exact. And one way that we can show some of that research and analysis of that research is by using these things called reporting verbs. And you probably already use these. We've already seen them. In the last example I've just talked to you about, we had suggests. Now, reporting verbs are really powerful and they have different strengths. And using them exactly means that we're actually showing some of our critical thinking in the choice of the verb that we use. So obviously, if we've read something and we've seen that a researcher is maybe just outlining a process, we could use outline or describe. We've seen that's what they're doing. If we're seeing that some researchers might be putting forward a suggestion, we obviously use suggest or intimate. If we see from our zoomed in analysis that some researchers or writers are really putting forward a very strong point of view, then we use argue, claim, strongly believe. These words are packed with analysis. They show your analysis. So if you tend to fall into the strategy of just using the same ones over and over again, maybe it's time to mix it up a little bit and just think a little bit more about what you've actually read about, and then use these words to introduce that research. And just by using one piece of language or a little phrase, you're indicating quite a lot of analysis and zoomed in reading of your texts. So that's the first element of language we're just going to mention. And then obviously those words link into phrases. These are phrases here that show critical analysis. And I've put them up as an example, and you can see some reporting verbs in those. But a really good place to actually look for more examples and really getting that feel for language that you can use will be to look here at the Manchester Phrase Bank. If you just Google Manchester Phrase Bank, you're going to see it. And again, I'm going to come back to this a little bit more in the quiz. But the Manchester Phrase Bank is a really good place to start to help you really use a variety of critical phrases and a variety of language in your writing, and use language which is specific and accurate, as we've seen in some of the other examples we've looked at today. Final note here. Remember, scientific writing is not us chatting to our friends. In that example where we'd seen that that student had obviously not really planned or thought, we saw an awful lot of these sorts of elements in that writing. We saw, contractions or short forms. We don't use that. We use would not instead of wouldn't, could not instead of couldn't, cannot instead of can't. We don't use these sorts of cliches. We don't use informal language that we would use to talk to our friends. We try to cut down on abbreviations if we can, and of course we all know that we do not use the first person in our scientific writing. The evidence suggests, not I suggest. So these 3 previous slides, including this one, just bring together this presentation. So what we've got now is we've got a stepped process. And we're going to come back to that process in the quiz. So what I'd like you to do now is to maybe pause this. If you've watched this at the beginning of the presentation, of the quiz, you might want to now run through the questions. Or if you've run through the quiz and you've come back to this, now's the time to reflect and to go back to that slide that I've put right at the beginning of the quiz, where I've asked you to think about what you've learned from this session. So what have you learned? Is there more that you wanted answering in your what you want to know section? And if there is, do you need to maybe go and have a look at that? And at the end of the quiz, I've put a link to our other academic skills module, which is full of further resources. But stop and think, what have you learned? Is there something I haven't covered that you want to review again or review in more detail? I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope this will guide you to writing really effective level 6 scientific writing. And if you haven't done so already, have a go at the quiz, which will just reinforce some of the points that I've made.